The Yellow Tooth Adventure. Chapter 1.
The USS Constitution had departed Sector 00 en route to the Vega system in Sector 2040 when they crossed the path of a very old friend, Admiral Yellow Tooth, and his fleet. Tal called out to the captain.
"Sir, we are being hailed by an old friend."
David replied, on screen. "Admiral Yellow Tooth, it's so good to see you. What's your destination, sir?" The Admiral smiled a very toothy smile.
"Friend David, we are headed to the Vega system. And you?"
David replied, "The Vega system." The Admiral nodded.
"We can travel together and renew old acquaintances. That would be enjoyable. Captain Stevens, would you and your lady care to teleport aboard and dine with us?"
David replied, "May I bring my kids as well?"
"Our appearance wouldn't frighten them."
asked the Admiral. David thought, then replied, "If it frightens them, it will be all right. They need to learn that appearance is irrelevant. Character is the important issue. But his mother and I would be with him." The Admiral smiled and said,
1800 hours. Your time?"
David agreed and signed off. Stella turned.
"I don't think Ginny or Davy will have any problem. After all, they have been with the Krill negotiators and this eclectic crew of ours."
The Admiral had asked David what their family usually ate, and he told the Admiral what they liked. Upon arriving on the Admiral's ship, the little family noticed what smelled like lasagna. The Admiral's cook told David what was in the dish, and it was what they knew as lasagna. It was meatless lasagna, with plant protein used to mimic meat. David learned that the Admiral's race were herbivores. Admiral Yellow Tooth, his deputy, and his aide dined with David's family. During the meal, nothing was said about their particular missions. After the meal, the Admiral's son, a young Marine, took Davy and gave him a ship's tour. But Ginny stayed with her folks. The tour took about an hour, and Davy had a new friend when they returned, Private Red Claw. While the two sons toured the ship, the Admiral, his deputy, David, and Stella with Ginny, talked about their respective missions, which actually coincided. Both were going to obtain the curative mineral that had saved members of their crews. The treaty that the 9 civilizations had hammered out allowed the two commanders to share information about what might lie ahead. David told the Admiral about their trip through the Gavergon Wormhole. The Admiral's face lit up in anticipation of such a new adventure.
"Navigating a wormhole, that would be exhilarating."
David smiled at the Admiral's words. "Admiral, we were through the wormhole so quickly that we had no time to examine the experience." But he was not to be denied.
"I will be the last ship in and will attempt to stop during the transition. It may not work, but then again, maybe it will."
After the fleet and the Constitution arrived at the Gavergon Wormhole, the Admiral told David to enter first, then his fleet of 8 ships, and his last. The Admiral did so that he might try to stay in the wormhole and study it. The Constitution exited the wormhole, and after a moment, 8 of Admiral Yellow Tooth's fleet exited, one after another, but the Admiral's ship did not appear. Tal called.
"Captain, the Admiral's deputy is hailing us."
David ordered, on screen. Commodore Bluetail appeared.
"Captain, where is the Admiral?"
David replied, "He told me he was going to try to stop while in the wormhole. I don't know where he is. We should try and find him, I guess. Let me see what we can do from here. I'll call you in 2 hours. Okay?" David called the sensor lab. "Dale, see what you can find out about that wormhole." Unfortunately, the Admiral hasn't caught up with us yet. Admiral Sim's voice replied.
"We're on it, sir."
David heard a quiet giggle as the call closed. "Computer, how long was the wormhole transit?"
The wormhole transit was exactly 16 nanoseconds.
"Computer, when we enter the wormhole, can you stop the ship after 8 nanoseconds?"
Affirmative.
Dale's voice came over the comm.
"Captain, I'm not able to see anything beyond the event horizon of the wormhole."
David shrugged. "Okay, I guess we'll just have to go in and see what we can see." David called Commodore Bluetail. "Commodore, we'll have to go into the wormhole and see if we can find any clue as to the Admiral's whereabouts." The Commodore asked.
"Shall I send a ship with you?"
"No, let's not put any more in jeopardy than we have to." The Commodore responded.
"Captain, we'll do as you say."
The translator paused, then said,
"Calm seas and fair winds. Bluetail out."
David asked, "Computer, why the pause?"
Commodore Bluetail's words cannot be properly translated into English. I understood it as a greeting similar to your calm seas and fair winds.
Relay to the Commodore the same response we normally use. David asked for ship-wide and said, "Now hear this. This is the captain. Our transit through the wormhole took 16 nanoseconds. We will enter the wormhole and stop after 8 nanoseconds to see if we can find the Admiral. Helm, enter the wormhole SL-25. Computer all stop after 8 nanoseconds. Execute." The ship lurched and stopped.
We are at all stop.
David called the sensor lab. "Kids, what can you tell me?" Admiral Sims' voice responded.
Who are you calling kids, Captain?
Everyone heard the smile in her voice. David replied, "When you are my age, I'll quit calling you two kids." She replied,
Your age, you can't be over 40. So I'm older than you.
David smiled, "I'm over 500 years old, Admiral. I was born in 1940. So I am 536 years old." David heard her gasp and,
Then I guess we are all kids to you.
Dale reported,
Those creatures we see when we exceed UL-10. They are all over the place here.
David directed, "Tal, let's see the outside." On the screen, the crew saw the creatures they had observed when the ship exceeded UL-10. They seemed interested in the ship, peering through the portholes and touching the hull. David directed, "Tal, hail the Admiral. See if we can contact him." "Dale, talk to me." Dale replied,
There are a grunch of those creatures out there. So many it's hard to make sense of the sensor's readings.
Wait! I see something!
Dale said,
The sensors have picked up something. It appears to be a vessel. I can't quite make out the configuration.
Captain, we're being hailed.
David responded, split screen. Configuration on the left, comm on the right. The crew saw only a blank screen on the comm side of the screen. On the other hand, the voice had a severe Cockney accent.
USS Constitution, this is the HMS Hood. Ahoy.
On the configuration side of the screen, the crew saw a ship. Stella gasped.
It's an English Admiral-class battleship. I thought the Bismarck sunk the Hood in May of 1941.
Over the comm came, in that Cockney accent.
Hey, was that the sweet sound of a woman's voice I heard?
David replied, "That was the voice of my helmsman. This is Captain Stevens of the USS Constitution. How long have you and your ship been here, and how did you get here?" Then over the comm, in a high British accent.
"Captain Stevens, this is Captain Irving Glennie of the HMS Hood. May I come aboard? I'll tell you what we know."
David agreed and told the teleporter crewman to bring Captain Glennie aboard. Then, as the Hood's captain began to materialize on the teleporter pad, David ordered the captain to be piped aboard. Captain Glennie stepped off the teleporter pad, hand extended to shake David's hand.
"Captain Stevens, you're a Yank, ain't you?"
David led the captain to a suite and invited him to have a meal or a drink, as he wished. They sat, and David called Larry to join them. "Captain Glennie, this is Commander Lawrence Sorensen, my first officer." "Larry, Captain Glennie." Larry shook hands with Captain Glennie and asked,
Captain of the HMS Hood, sunk by the Bismarck in May of 1941?
Captain Glennie looked at the two officers of the Constitution.
"The Bismarck did not sink us. As the shells were coming, suddenly we were here, wherever this is. Do you know where we are? And how do we escape this void?"
Captain, what's your ship's complement?
Asked Larry. He answered,
1418. "Why?"
Larry answered,
We'll have to ferry your men home. But we can only carry half your crew at a time.
The captain asked,
"Could you just tow the Hood home?"
David responded, "We will tow the Hood, but your crew would be dead after leaving this void, as you called it." He screwed up his face in a puzzled expression.
"I don't understand."
Finally, Larry and David said as one man,
Brace yourself, Captain.
You are many light years from Earth. And many years from your encounter with the Bismarck." Captain Glennie slumped over, hands over his face.
"What now?"
David answered, "We will inform our Chief of Naval Operations of your situation, and ask him to inform the British government to expect you. Your crew and your ship. I imagine Great Britain will want to celebrate the valiant crew of the HMS Hood." Larry continued,
You and your ship would have to wait for us to return after we carry the first half of your crew to Earth. I'm sorry, Captain, that's just how it will have to be.
David called Admiral Sims. "Admiral, would you please come to cabin 420, deck H4? We have something very unusual and yet interesting to deal with." She responded,
On my way.
When the Admiral arrived, David said, "Admiral, this is Captain Irvin Glennie of the HMS Hood. The HMS Hood that the Bismarck obsessively sank in May of 1941. Captain Glennie, this is Admiral Susan Sims, formerly Stone." Captain Glennie stood wide-eyed.
A woman admiral?
David smiled. "Yes, a female admiral, and quite a formidable one at that. You both had better sit down. You look a little green around the gills." She blushed. "Admiral, we have the HMS Hood here in this wormhole with a ship's complement of 1,415 seamen we need to ferry home to Great Britain. But this would take at least 2 trips. We have room to carry about 700 at a time. And, frankly, we need to get Admiral Marovich involved to find a place where the crew of the Hood can be taken." Looking like a deer caught in the headlights, she said.
Captain Stevens, what do you want me to do?
He replied, "When we get out of this wormhole, talk to Admiral Marovich and try to get him to coordinate with the British government. We need to have someplace to put the Hood's crew as soon as we get home." She replied.
Let's do it, Captain.
David turned to Captain Glennie. "You need to have a senior officer go with the first trip to control your crewmen on the way home, possibly your first officer. Then, Captain, let's teleport you back to the Hood to start getting you home." David continued, "Captain, I will have to leave you briefly to contact our fleet, and then I will return to ferry your crew home." Finally, David ordered the ship to return to the fleet so that he might inform Commodore Bluetail of their events and check whether the Admiral had shown up. The Hood's crew's transfer began upon returning to the Hood. After 6 hours, 708 British seamen were aboard the Constitution. And David ordered the Constitution to exit the wormhole and start back to Sector 00, Hank, home, fastest way possible. Helm, top speed. Hank and Stella replied.
Aye, sir.
David had the first officer of the Hood on the bridge. "Commander, we are 10 days from Earth. We need to show your crewmen how to use the facilities on this ship." Larry took the commander and led him away to get the necessary facilities familiarization. David commanded, "Computer, take us out of this wormhole."
Affirmative.
8 nanoseconds later, the Constitution exited the wormhole and turned toward Sector 00. Admiral Sims asked,
May I use the ready room to call Admiral Marovich?
David nodded yes. After 2 hours, Admiral Sims approached David.
Admiral Marovich is working with the British government
to have a place for these seamen when we get there. David turned to the Hood's first officer. "Commander, our journey will be 10 days. Please advise your crew. I will not allow trouble on my ship." The commander replied,
"There won't be any trouble. I will deal with any problems the same as I have as long as I have been first officer of the Hood."
David smiled, nodded, and thanked the commander. Admiral Sims tapped David on the shoulder.
David, I'll be with my husband. Okay?
David only nodded. Their journey was uneventful. As they approached Earth, Admiral Marovich called and directed that the Hood's crew be teleported to Windsor Castle's grounds. Checking the sensors, the grounds were crowded with military personnel rank and file waiting with the king. David signaled the teleporter operator to begin the transport of the Hood's crew. The first officer was the last man to go. As the crew of the Constitution watched, they saw the king step up to the first officer, salute him and shake his hand. Then after a moment, the commander knelt before the king, and it seemed that the king knighted him. Satisfied, David ordered the Constitution to return to the wormhole and the rest of the Hood's crew. Arriving in the wormhole, they found the Hood, made contact, teleported the remainder of the crew to the Constitution, and took the Hood in tow using their tractor beam. Another uneventful 10 days and the crew of the Hood was teleported onto the grounds of Windsor Castle, reunited with the first contingent of the rescue. And using the tractor and repulsor beams, set the HMS Hood in the mouth of the Thames River. The king asked that the captain and first officer of the Constitution teleport down to the ceremony. David and Larry changed into their dress uniforms and teleported down. The king spoke to the crowd.
"First, we thank our friends from the United System Navy for bringing our valiant crew and ship back to us. Captain Stephen and Sorensen, thank you. Now I ask that both kneel. I dub thee Sir David Stevens and Sir Lawrence Sorensen, honoured knights of the realm. Rise, Sir Stevens, rise, Sir Sorensen."
David and Larry blushed, thanked His Majesty, and asked for leave to return to their mission, and the king gave leave. David ordered the Constitution back to the wormhole to find Admiral Yellow Tooth. The Constitution transited the wormhole to check with Commodore Bluetail whether the Admiral had been in contact. He had not. It was agreed that the Constitution would start the search again. The Commodore and the fleet would complete their mission because this was the Admiral's last order to the Commodore. The Constitution returned to the wormhole, the computer stopping the ship every nanosecond. The first nanosecond, The crew saw a cruiser and spoke with the captain and crew of the USS Granville NXC 1001, a United System Navy ship that had vanished 246 years ago. No sign of the Granville had ever been found, and after an exhaustive search for 3 years, the effort was finally abandoned. David met with the captain of the Granville, Captain Gary Anderson, and arranged for the Granville to be towed out of the wormhole. The Granville was UL capable. It would take them 6 months to return to Sector 00. But the ship's crew cheered at the possibility of seeing Earth again. David explained that the reason for the Constitution to tow the Granville was that the Constitution was able to navigate the wormhole where the Granville could not without extensive modifications and training. The Constitution activated the tractor beams latched onto the Granville. 16 nanoseconds later released the Granville and pointed them in the right direction, wishing them calm seas and fair winds. Much later, the crew of the Constitution was informed that the crew of the Granville was welcomed home and celebrated. Captain Anderson's crew were all retired with generous pensions, and many found new pursuits never to leave the ground again. Captain Anderson was promoted to Rear Admiral and assigned to teach at the Naval Academy at Annapolis. As for the Constitution, they returned to the wormhole to continue their search for Admiral Yellow Tooth. As measured from the original entry, the ship stopped 1 nanosecond in the wormhole. Admiral Sims reported from the sensor lab that the only things in sensor range were the UL-10 creatures. David was about to order another nanosecond into the wormhole when an ensign shouted,
Captain, look!
On the screen was an alien vessel of unknown design, very much like a giant corkscrew. David ordered, Tall, hail that ship. Tall reported,
No response, Captain.
Larry asked,
Do we dare teleport to that ship?
David replied, We teleported the crew of the Hood back and forth, it should be okay for us. Take your enhanced team and see what you find. Larry smiled and called his team, and teleported to the corkscrew ship. Larry reported that the team had arrived safely on the ship. An hour later, Larry walked on the bridge of the Constitution, saying,
It's just an empty shell, nothing else.
Larry suggested that they just shove the Hulk off into the darkness. Using the repulsor beam, that is just what they did. Then David ordered another nanosecond into the wormhole.